Good day. Today is Wednesday, 9th July 2025, and even as the President of the United States and his officials, as we will see shortly, struggle to get round the enormous limitations that they now find themselves in as a result of the weapons shortages that the United States is now beset by, the Russians have conducted another massive strike, combined missile and drone strike against Ukraine. These strikes are now becoming, as I said, practically a nightly occurrence. Now, apparently, around 740 drones and missiles were launched at Ukraine in total over the course of last night. The great majority of these, around 720, were apparently ground drones. Now, the Ukrainians claim that they shot down nearly all of the drones and that they were also successful in shooting down all of the Iskander missiles that were also launched. And I believe the KH-101 subsonic drones that were launched also by Tupolev 95 strategic bombers, by the way. But they now grudgingly accept that they are unable to shoot down the Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. At least some of them were launched at Ukraine as well, and the Ukrainians seem to acknowledge that these at least are getting through. I'm going to say straight away that I regard all of these Ukrainian figures now as largely fictitious. I noticed that the British news agency Reuters continues to report them as if they were fact, but it seems to me that, as has been consistently the case with Ukrainian claims of numbers of missiles and drones shot down, Ukrainian claims that they've been making ever since the autumn of 2022, October 2022, when the Russians first began their big missile offensives against Ukraine. I believe that these figures that the Ukrainians are producing are mostly wrong or inaccurate, and indeed in some cases straightforwardly made up. Now, today we are still waiting to get a proper understanding and assessment of what the targets were that the Russians were aiming at and how much damage they actually did. But the general consensus appears to be that the primary targets that the Russians struck at last night were two airfields, one located near the city of Zhytomyr in the western part of central Ukraine, and the other in the city of Lutsk, which is located somewhere further to the west of Zhytomyr. Now, there are apparently satellite pictures taken last night showing large fire anomalies, in other words, burning fires, in Zhytomyr, suggesting that large numbers of missiles and drones managed to strike that particular target in that particular city. Most reports appear to acknowledge that this was probably an airfield, and it is a reasonable guess that it is one of the airfields that the F-16s are based at, Ukraine's F-16s are based at. There are still no comparable satellite pictures for Lutsk, which may have been the more important target, though that's very difficult to say with any certainty. There are some pictures which show drones and KH-101 subsonic missiles striking targets in Lutsk, or I say striking targets in Lutsk. Some are saying that they're being shot down by the Ukrainian air defenses. I'm not obviously in a position to say. I'm not able to study and examine this film properly. But somewhat surprisingly, we've still not yet got satellite pictures showing fire anomalies or anything like that from Lutsk. Maybe somebody has taken a decision that the situation is so bad that they don't want to release those pictures. Though let me stress, that is a guess. It is pure guess, and no one should assume that it is true. Anyway, there it is. That's what happened last night. The biggest single combined drone and missile attack that the Russians have conducted against Ukraine up to now. As we see, the pace and intensity of these attacks is gradually growing night by night as production of drones, Duran drones, and missiles in Russia swells. I say missiles, though it's worth saying that the Russians are now launching fewer missiles in individual strikes than they used to do in, say, 2022, 2023. But then there's been a fundamental difference from the air offensives that the Russians conducted in 2022, 2023. Because at that time, what tended to happen was that the Russians would launch around 100 missiles on a single night, in a single strike, and then there would usually be another similar strike perhaps later in the same month, but it would be most unusual, indeed almost unheard of, for the Russians to be launching missiles more often than that. So you would usually get one, sometimes two big missile strikes in any particular month. Most of the rest of the time, the skies over Ukraine were quiet. Now what is happening is that the Russians are filling the skies every night with drones, Duran drones, and they are launching usually around 10 to 20 missiles each night alongside the drones. Probably, if you added up all of the missiles that the Russians launch over the course of a month, it is a greater total than the missiles the Russians would launch against Ukraine in any particular month in 2022, the autumn of 2022, 2023. But they launch fewer missiles over the course of any particular night or day. Now, I say that it's perhaps also worth adding that whereas in 2022, 2023, the missiles the Russians would use against Ukraine were overwhelmingly subsonic cruise missiles, the KH-101s launched by the bombers, and the Calibres launched by the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Now it is an extraordinary variety of different missiles. You still get KH-101s, apparently significantly updated and made stealthier than the KH-101s that were launched back in 2022. But you still get those, but you also get Iskander missiles of various descriptions and classifications. You get Kinjal missiles, all of these operating at one and the same time. Sometimes the Russians launch KH-69 subsonic missiles launched by tactical fighter bombers. Anyway, it is a much more complex picture than what we used to see then, and far more sophisticated, with the drones and the missiles operating in extraordinarily complex patterns. The drones certainly able to conduct maneuvers and to operate at high altitudes and low altitudes, to use cloud cover, to work at various speeds, to conduct diving attacks. As I said, it's a far more sophisticated and worked through bombing offensive than the kind that we used to see earlier in the war. And one senses that it's not just that the Russians have many more missiles and drones to work with, but that they have become extremely adept and skilled at using these missiles and drones in a way that both evade and deplete Ukrainian air defenses, and in ways also that are undoubtedly intended to do the maximum damage. Now, satellite pictures have recently been appearing of the great factory in Kazan, which is one of the big factories. Apparently there's now 2 factories making Geran drones, but this factory, it seems, is being further expanded. New buildings, large new buildings, have been added, and there's also additional accommodation built for the workers, suggesting that the workforce of this factory is increasing. The total assumption is that before long, at some point in the next few months, the Russians will be able to produce around 1,000 of these drones, the Geran drones, every day. And by the way, I said that the missiles have become more complex and that the drones have become more complex. It seems that there are lots of different types of Geran drones. There are some which use jet engines. There are some which continue to use turboprop engines, but more powerful turboprop engines than the original Geran drones that the Russians first employed did. As I said, some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller, some of them are just decoys, others carry significant warheads. Anyway, the production at this factory in Kazan is likely to increase, and there are rumors that a second factory, equipped perhaps, according to some reports, with Korean workers, North Korean workers, that factory is likely to be entering production fairly soon, increasing the number of these drones even more. Now, there have been claims that in order to cause the entire Ukrainian air defense system to collapse under the weight of these nightly attacks, the Russians would need to use at least 1,000 of these drones and supplemental missiles every night. So we're still perhaps some way from that point. I say that's been suggested. It's appeared on some of the Russian Telegram channels, and there is a good commentary about it on Slavyangrad, just to say. So 1,000 drones a night, supplemented by whatever missiles the Russians care to launch at individual targets during these drone attacks. We're some distance, as I said, from that point, but 700 plus drones, according to the Ukrainians themselves, were used last night. Maybe the Russians are coming closer to that point also. And as I said, this clearly giving an insight into an enormous increase in the military production of these drones, and no reason to think that we have yet reached the limit of this. Now, that then brings me back to the, some say, contradictory signals being made in the United States by President Donald Trump. Now, yesterday he attended a cabinet meeting in Washington, and as is often the way, in fact, as is always the way, and I think this is a very bad practice, incidentally, before the cabinet meeting took place, the media were brought in, and they were allowed to ask Trump questions, and a kind of impromptu news conference took place. I should make it absolutely clear that I do not agree with this practice. It is good that Donald Trump meets the media often, and it's good that the practice of contact with the media, public contact with the media, which essentially stopped for the reasons we all know under Joe Biden, has now resumed. But it seems to me that we've gone from a situation under Biden where there was barely any public exchanges between the president and the media at all, to a situation now when there is far too much of it. And I say that because, in my opinion, saying too much is as bad and as misconceived as saying too little. Obviously, the president needs to get his views across. The public needs to be able to see that he's there and in charge of the government. But the president also needs to choose his words carefully, and he needs to think carefully in advance what he's going to say, and to be briefed carefully in advance by his advisors and officials before he meets the media. He is, after all, the President of the United States, still, by some people's estimation, the most powerful man in the world, though personally I don't really see that anymore, but that's another matter. But anyway, he's still the President of the United States. What he says, therefore, is, or ought to be, important. It's essential that the President, when he does speak to the media, conveys a clear, consistent message, and that he does so sparingly in ways that are properly thought through. Now, that's not what's happening at the moment. So, yesterday, at this cabinet meeting, we had a good example of this, because the media trooped in and they found the president in a, I thought, my impression was, a rather bad mood. Firstly, he was asked questions about a certain individual who's called a financier, though he was not a financier, and who, as every one of you knows, committed suicide, or so we're told, in rather complicated circumstances, and who was accused of engaging in trafficking. I am choosing my words incredibly carefully, because I sense that the sensitivities that for a time had eased in discussion of this topic have now intensified hugely. Anyway, the President and his Attorney General were telling us at one time that they were going to provide full information about what happened. And then the day before yesterday, a report came out which said that no information is going to be provided after all, because there is nothing to see. There was no trafficking, or at least there was trafficking, but there were no clients. There was no attempts at extortion. There was no reason to think, apparently, any connection to intelligence agencies. And there really isn't anything to see here. And that the question of whether this person died by suicide really isn't a significant one, because there is no doubt that he did. Now, as I said, I'm not going to discuss all of that in this program. I'm only going to say that I have some difficulty believing some of these claims, but anyway, what do I know? Having said that, the President and his officials are given rather different guidance about this story before. The Attorney General, in particular, gave the clear impression earlier that she had on her desk information which seemed to contradict the narrative that we were being given yesterday. She has, by the way, in fairness, sought to provide an explanation which all of you know about and you can all find if you wish. I didn't find it especially compelling, but there we go. Anyway, we've had all of that. The fact that, as I said, this information is not being supplemented again. And the president was asked about it, and he was clearly very unhappy about being asked those questions. And in my opinion, he avoided giving a cogent answer. And the same pattern then repeated itself when the topic of Ukraine came up, because the president was also inevitably asked about that. And he was asked specifically about the information about the cessation of weapons deliveries to Ukraine. He clearly wasn't happy to talk about that subject. He started saying the usual things about Vladimir Putin that he often says, that Putin talks very nice, but he gives lots of BS. Where do the Americans when they speak to him? That is, by the way, very unfair. Putin has been saying essentially the same thing ever since he spoke to the Russian Foreign Ministry back in June 2024. He set out his terms clearly then. He's hardened them gradually since then, but he's never really deviated or changed his position from that point. If the Americans expected him to and are disappointed to find him consistent in his stance, well, all I can say is that they weren't listening and they weren't taking into proper account what he had been saying. But anyway, the president spoke, as I said, rather harshly about Putin. He gave indications that he might be seriously considering imposing the kind of sanctions that Lindsey Graham and Senator Blumenthal have been talking about. And he clearly felt very awkward and embarrassed about the whole question of weapons deliveries to Ukraine. And he distanced himself from the decision. He seemed to imply that the decision to stop the weapons deliveries had nothing to do with him. And he said that the United States would do what it could to help Ukraine during this time when it is coming under these enormous attacks by the Russians. In my opinion, precisely because these are such awkward and politically difficult topics, it might have been wiser politically for the president not to have said anything at all and not to have met with the media and to have tried to answer questions about them. I say that politically. Of course, an alternative course would have been to be much more forthright and frank about the realities on the question of the so-called financier, who was not, by the way, a financier. On the question of the so-called financier, I don't think there is very much that the president could have said for various reasons. But on the other question, on the question of Ukraine, the better policy, in my opinion, would have been to simply refer all questions on that topic to the Pentagon and not to have the president answer questions about them. That's my own view. I don't think the president should allow the media to speak to him in the way that they do. I think he is overconfident, if I have to say, in his handling of the media, and he lets his prolixity sometimes get the better of him. But anyway, where does all this leave us? Where are we in reality with these weapons deliveries? I said over the last couple of programs that whatever Donald Trump wants to do, the reality is that he is out of the kind of weapons that the Ukrainians are demanding, and he simply cannot conjure these weapons out of thin air, and that whatever his wishes about supplying weapons to Ukraine might be, he simply cannot get round that awkward fact? Well, after I did my program yesterday, an article appeared in, of all places, The Guardian, which essentially confirmed what I had been previously saying. The article, which is by Hugo Lowell, says that US has only 25% of all Patriot missile interceptors needed for Pentagon's military plans. Low stockpiles for the crucial Patriot missile interceptors led to Trump administration pausing transfers to Ukraine. In other words, it was not exactly a policy decision. It was not because the United States wants to stop supplying weapons to Ukraine. It is because their stockpiles are critically low. And the article goes on to say the United States only has about 25% of the Patriot missile interceptors it needs for all of the Pentagon's military plans after burning through stockpiles in the Middle East in recent months, an alarming depletion that led to the Trump administration freezing the latest transfer of munitions to Ukraine. The stockpile of the Patriot missiles has fallen so low that it raised concerns inside the Pentagon that it could jeopardize potential US military operations, and Deputy Defense Secretary Stephen Feinberg authorized the transfer to be halted while they reviewed where weapons were being sent. And then the article goes on to say that the administration began a review of the depleted level of the Patriot and other munitions stockpiles back in February, that claims that it was Elbridge Colby who countermanded the decision to transfer the weapons to Ukraine are untrue, that Colby did prepare some kind of paper recommending that steps be taken to husband the remaining reserves of these munitions and missiles, but that the final decision was made by Stephen Feinberg and the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. Now, there continues to be in the media an attempt to distance Donald Trump himself from that decision. So the Wall Street Journal, I believe, is claiming that Trump himself was blindsided by that decision. He knew nothing about it before it was made. Supposedly, it was a complete surprise to him. And we've had leaks, or supposed leaks, from various officials that say that. I'm going to say straightforwardly that if you believe that claim, then I have a bridge to sell you. I cannot imagine officials in the Department of Defense making a decision of this kind on their own authority without first consulting the president. We're talking about, after all, missile deliveries to a key American ally. Donald Trump may have his own issues with President Zelensky. He may have his own doubts about the long-term prospects of the American commitment to Ukraine, but any decision to halt missile and weapons deliveries to Ukraine is inevitably going to be a political decision, and I cannot imagine Hegseth, Feinberg, or Colby acting without the agreement of the highest authority, which is, of course, the president himself. I'm sorry to contradict flatly the messaging that we are getting on this topic, and indeed the impression that Trump himself is seeking to give on this, but I have no doubt at all that he was involved and at least gave the green light to this decision, even if he probably didn't initiate it. So, critical depletion of US stockpiles. This has been a steady process since the start of the conflict in Ukraine. The article in The Guardian is clearly extremely well sourced. Somebody in the Pentagon is obviously very angry by the decisions and the inconsistent messaging from the administration and by the stories that have been circulating in places like NBC that the stockpiles are in fact in a healthy state when it is clear that they are not, and they've gone out of their way to leak the truth about the actual state of the stockpiles to The Guardian, a media outlet which is widely read in the United States, but is a step away from the US media. And I suspect the reason for that, by the way, is that the people who provided this updated information, are aware that after the leaking of the Defense Intelligence Agency report on the effect of the attack on the Fordo nuclear facility, the administration is now putting pressure on the American media to stop the American media from publishing these kind of stories. So somebody took the decision in Washington that in order to get round that, the way they would do it would be by providing this information to the British media instead. So we learn about the critical state of US Patriot missile stockpiles. They're only at 25% of the level that the United States, or at least that the Pentagon, feels it needs in order to be reasonably confident of conducting a war, or at least coping with an immediate emergency. Now, in fact, the situation is even worse, because the article says that US only has 25% of all Patriot missile interceptors needed for Pentagon's military plans. And the key operative word here is all, because there are many different types of Patriot missile interceptors, and the one that is of most critical importance to Ukraine is the PAC-3 interceptor, which is the one that is used to shoot down ballistic missiles. And that particular interceptor, which is apparently the most sophisticated amongst the various Patriot missile interceptors that Raytheon produces, is at an especially low rate of production. I'm not quite sure. I've heard figures as low as 30 a year. I suspect that must be wrong, but I'm not going to try and guess what the actual number truly is. Anyway, the point is that it seems that it is these PAC-3 missile interceptors that are in even more critically low supply than all of the other Patriot missile interceptors that exist in the US stockpile. And of course, it is precisely these PAC-3 missile interceptors that the Ukrainians are pleading for, given the attacks by the ballistic missiles, the Iskanders and the Kinzhals and all the others. Whether, in fact, these interceptors really are successful in shooting down Kinzhal missiles and Iskander-M ballistic missiles is open to question. Yuri Ignat, the Ukrainian Air Force's spokesman, has at various times suggested not. Anyway, there it is. So Trump apparently is now deeply embarrassed. He's caught between a rock and a hard place. The Ukrainians are demanding more interceptors. He's had pleas for more interceptors to be provided to Ukraine from Friedrich Merz. The Democrats are trying to make a big issue of this, and so are sections of the media such as NBC. And over and above and beyond this, if you're the President of the United States, whichever president you are, you do not want to telegraph to American adversaries that the United States is short of critical weapons. And a president like Trump, who spends all his time bragging about the enormous and tremendous capabilities of the US military and of its weapons and how the US has the best weapons in the world, probably feels especially embarrassed about this. He must be, and here I'm guessing, but I'm sure I'm right, he must be particularly infuriated about the fact that the Russians are able to go on hitting Ukraine night after night with hundreds of drones and scores of missiles, and that the United States is not remotely able to match that capability. So, firstly, he distanced himself from the decision, a decision, as I said, in which he was definitely a part, and he gives the impression to the media that he's going to supply Ukraine with weapons after all. And we've had some more reports now about this, which cast all of his various decisions and statements and comments in a rather interesting light. First of all, we've had a rather detailed account of Trump's conversation on Friday with Friedrich Merz. Merz was apparently pushing Trump hard about resuming supplies of Patriot missile interceptors to Ukraine. Trump then asked Merz whether Germany could supply those Patriot missile interceptors instead, because American supplies are so short. Merz responded by saying that, in fact, German inventories of Patriot missile interceptors are even lower than American ones. And the Germans have given an even higher proportion of their missile interceptors to Ukraine that the United States has done. It's not exactly a rejection, but it comes fairly close. And apparently there was then some discussion about the United States perhaps selling Patriot missile interceptors to Germany, and about where Patriot missile interceptors might be found amongst American allies around the world, though the reports say that Trump and Merz in the end came to no final decision. And the Wall Street Journal today is saying that Trump has now asked the Pentagon whether the United States can perhaps supply Ukraine with another Patriot missile battery. I doubt that the Pentagon will be very happy with that request, and quite plausibly, if they're looking and generally worried about the state of their inventory, they will push back on that. But in the meantime, Trump has authorized the delivery of 10 Patriot missile interceptors to Ukraine. The batch in Poland that was stopped, the delivery of which was stopped and which was returned to the United States, or perhaps forwarded to Israel, apparently included 30 missile interceptors. So Ukraine, despite Trump appearing to reverse himself or wanting to give the impression that the decision to stop deliveries had been reversed, the United States is only able to supply a third of the latest batch, just 10. Now, I'm assuming that these are all Pac 3 interceptors. The United States, apparently the Patriot system, uses roughly 2 interceptors to shoot down a ballistic missile. The Russians are launching ballistic missiles at Ukraine every night. They launch more than one ballistic missile at Ukraine every night. Of course, whether the missiles that Ukraine is going to receive, the 10 they're going to receive, are used against these missiles will depend on where those interceptors are based. Presumably, they're going to be sent to Kiev to protect Kiev. But let's assume the Russians conduct another big missile and drone strike against Kiev. It's likely that all of those Patriot missile interceptors from that batch will be used up. That whole delivery will be used up over the course of the next strike. There is simply no answer to this problem. One can look around, one can call American allies, and American allies around the world who are aware of the fact that American inventories of missile interceptors are now at critically low levels, are almost certainly now going to be even less willing to hand over missiles to Ukraine, because they know that there is no prospect of the United States ever replacing them, ever replacing any interceptors that they hand over in that way. Anyway, the United States can roam around the world, phoning up its various allies, the Japanese, the Saudis, whoever, trying to get missile interceptors from them. The United States can try to some extent to increase its own production of missile interceptors, but as the article in The Guardian acknowledges, that is extremely difficult, and numbers are only going to increase, production numbers are only going to increase slowly. The fact is, the United States is where it is, and there is simply no more of these missiles to give. The same is true of Stingers. Perhaps there's more flexibility to supply HIMARS missiles, but then the HIMARS missiles have suffered from reduced effectiveness for quite a long time. Anyway, now, they're not the powerful weapon they were back in the summer and early autumn of 2022 when they were first introduced. So, this is the reality. The United States is out of weapons. Back in 1956, the British and the French conducted a joint military operation against Egypt in connection with a crisis relating to the Egyptian nationalization of the Suez Canal, which up to that point had been owned mostly by British and French investors. And of course, the Suez Canal also seen by those countries as a strategic asset. And well, I'm not going to spend time here discussing the whole story of the Suez Crisis, as it is sometimes called. But it became very clear over the course of that crisis that the British and the French, the British especially, were operating beyond the limits of their capabilities, that they were coming up against opposition from the Americans and the Russians. And the British and the French had eventually to back down. The British, for them, the Suez Crisis is an event that has never fully dimmed in the memory. it could be said to be the moment when the British Empire finally died. I am not saying that this is a Suez moment that we are in today, when the United States is confronting the fact that it is short of weapons and cannot wage war against adversaries who have no shortages of weapons in the way that it once did. But we are approaching that point, and it's understandable that the US government is finding it very difficult to be fully open about this situation. But it's the intractable nature of this problem, the fact that there is now this big shortage of missile interceptors, that explains these very strange statements that the president is making and that are being made by his officials. They are faced by these shortages. They can't admit to them. It would be too much of a humiliation for the United States to do so, and it might be dangerous in terms of the message it conveys to American adversaries, particularly perhaps at this point Iran, even more than China. But they cannot at the same time resolve the underlying problem. And this is going to have a cascade effect, not just in terms of the conflict in Ukraine, but in other places too. Now, Arnaud Bertrand, who is one of the most astute of commentators, has written a long piece on his Substack blog, actually talking about all of this, and he's pointing out that behind all of the bombast and the bluster that comes from the US political class, the reality is of a US retreat around the world. He repeats earlier points he made about the fact that the United States, for example, is increasingly falling behind China in military competition, in the naval race, in the Pacific. There is, by the way, an increasing view within the United States, or so I understand, that China actually wants to keep the conflict in Ukraine going, wants this conflict to continue, precisely because it is distracting the United States and depleting US inventories, even as China's military position in the Pacific becomes stronger and stronger. Well, that may be. But anyway, Arnaud Bertrand talks about the fact that the United States, whether it likes it or not, is now engaged in a global retreat. Its military resources are simply not equal to the demands being made on them, and the economic and financial underpinning simply isn't there either. I think he perhaps overstates the case in some places, but this particular episode, to my mind, shows in the end that he is right. Well, anyway, that's the situation from the United States. They're unable to counter this Russian aerial war. The Russians, as I discussed in my program yesterday, are very confident that they can counter any sanctions, any further sanctions, including Lindsey Graham's bone-crushing sanctions that the United States imposes on them. They have China at their back. They have the BRICS mostly at their back as well. And on this, I have absolutely no doubt at all, overall, that they are right. And in the meantime, of course, their advances continue. Now, over the course of the last last 2 days, there's been more reports that the Russians have captured the important village of Yunakivka in Sumy region. This has never been fully corroborated, just to say. And the Ukrainians are conducting their own counterattack in Sumy region. And General Syrskyi, who's had a meeting with President Zelensky, has apparently assured Zelensky that the Ukrainians will reverse all of the strategic gains that the Russians made in this whole area, and that they will re-establish their presence in Belgorod and Kursk regions as well. So those are the brave words that General Syrskyi has made. In my opinion, this offensive that the Ukrainians are trying to conduct in Sumy region, or counterattack I should say, is going to prove another exercise in futility. Again, some of the commentators and mapping projects are getting overexcited about this. It reminds me a little bit, by the way, of the commentaries we got earlier this year about how Russian forces in Kotlino, the village to the southwest of Pokrovsk, had supposedly been surrounded and cut off, about how the Russians were about to lose Toretsk and that the Ukrainian counterattacks in Toretsk were about to regain control of that town. We're seeing the repetition of this whole narrative with the Sumy offensive, counteroffensive. I am going to suggest that the eventual effect of all of these counteroffensives is that they will further waste away what are now critically reduced Ukrainian resources and weaken the position of the Ukrainian military further still in this critical area of the conflict zone. However, Syrskyi's comments to Zelensky are interesting in themselves because, to my mind, they again highlight the key fact that for Zelensky, it is precisely the fighting in these northern territories, in Sumy region in particular, but probably in Kharkiv region as well, that is the most important, because it is where the Russians are closest to Kiev itself. If the Russians capture the city of Sumy, if the Russians advance into Chernigov, if they capture Kharkiv, well, Kiev itself is next. And Kiev is where Zelensky is, where the Ukrainian government is. He, I suspect, is haunted by his memories of the first days of the special military operation, when the Russians were at the gates of Kiev and when a Russian military reconnaissance unit actually advanced deep into Kiev at one point. He was frightened that the Russians might capture him, that they might try to storm Bankovo, the building where his office is located. He was worried that the Russians might actually target him. He's frightened of going through that particular nightmare all over again. A Ukrainian commentator has published what he says is a document originating from within the Ukrainian government discussing a possible evacuation of the Ukrainian government from Kiev to the west, unclear where, but perhaps Lvov, that's the obvious place. The Ukrainian authorities have said that this particular document is a fake and that there is no reality behind it. The commentator who published it said that this Ukrainian denial is false, that the document is undoubtedly authentic, and that he's in a position to authenticate it, and it is real. I'm not going to enter into a discussion as to who is telling the truth about this, But I personally would not be surprised if Zelensky has indeed authorized early planning for an evacuation of Kiev in case the Russian army approaches the capital once again. So clearly he will not want that to happen. He will want the Ukrainians to hold Sumy region, to push the Russians back if they can, to regain territory in Kursk and Belgorod regions, which apparently Syrskyi has again promised, to do all of these things. And my own guess is that he's going to insist that Kiev be protected to the point where Ukrainian forces elsewhere in Ukraine are not going to get the reinforcements that they need. Now, there has been an article in the American media discussing the situation of the Ukrainian troops south of Konstantinovka, where they are, depending on who you follow, either in a pocket or in an outright cauldron. I suspect it's more of the latter than the former, actually. This is in the area south of the reservoir. It speaks of a terrible situation for the Ukrainian troops there, that there's no rotation, that there's sporadic supplies, that the Russian drones now operate continuously, and that losses are high. The Russians, by the way, over the last couple of days, have been continuing to tighten their grip around this area south of the reservoir. It looks as if they're also gradually tightening their grip around Pokrovsk itself. A couple of days ago, a Russian unit broke into Novoekonomichny, east of Pokrovsk. We've not heard much more about what's going on in that particular battle, but most of the mapping projects concede further Russian advances in this area, that the Russians are gradually shortening their lines. In other words, they're acquiring more and more territory around Novoekonomichny and maybe within Novoekonomichny itself, all preparatory for the final capture of this village, which it is universally acknowledged will lead to an operational crisis for the Ukrainians still in Pokrovsk. And the Russians continue their advances west towards the Dnieper, and it seems that Russian forces are now engaged in some kind of broad offensive in Zaporozhye region, that they're starting to press northwards from the village of Kamyanska, which they recently captured, that they have reached another village north of Kamyanska. They're said to be around 40 kilometers south of the city of Zaporozhye. It's said that if they capture this next village, the roads leading west from Zaporozhye will be within range of Russian drones, and that this could, west and east of Zaporozhye would be within range of Russian drones, and this in turn would enable the Russians to start disrupting the movement of supplies through the city of Zaporozhye eastwards to the Ukrainian forces that are trying to hold the Russians back as they advance towards the Dnieper. So Ukraine's operational crisis is deepening. There's even been a report from one Ukrainian commentator that Ukraine is now so short of infantry that, again, he claims that there's only around 30,000 Ukrainian troops holding positions along the front lines at any one time. Again, I don't believe that figure, but that's what he says. And he also speaks about Ukrainian over-dependence on FPV drones. And of course, even as the Russians swamp the skies with their Duran drones, they're doing the same with their FPV drones as well. Alexei Arestovich, Zelensky's now permanently antagonized former spin doctor, is now claiming that if Putin made the decision, the war in Ukraine could be over within 2 months if Putin committed all of the Russian forces. He suggests that Putin is not doing this because he has some kind of intentional policy to this effect, that it's enabling, that the war is enabling Putin to reshape Russian society, to consolidate political control, and to remodel the Russian economy on a more planned basis, away from the neoliberal free market basis that it had started to take in the 1990s. I think this is much too sophisticated. I very much doubt that Putin really is thinking in this way. It is the case, however, that the Russians, for who knows, well, we can only guess at their reasons, are still working mostly with the resources they have in Ukraine. They've not yet committed, for example, their reserve armies or done any of those things. My own guess is that they're still waiting. They're still preparing for that breakthrough when it comes. They're still, in other words, operating according to their deep battle doctrines. But anyway, I don't think it is as complex or as sophisticated a strategy as Arestovich says. But against that, you can see why the Russians, why he might be saying things like this, given the increasingly difficult position that the Ukrainians find themselves in. Now, despite that, the Russians still continue to press the Ukrainians to explain their stance in the negotiations, future negotiations in Istanbul. And we had some more comments about this from Peskov. He told journalists this: you know that certain work has already been done and 2 very difficult rounds of negotiations in Istanbul have been held. We are expecting the 3rd round to take place after all, and the dialogue to be continued. We need to start discussing the memoranda that were exchanged, because, of course, the Ukrainians also provided their memorandum, which basically calls for a freezing of the conflict. That will be a very complicated process and will take more than 1 night or 1 day. We hope that Trump and his team will continue efforts to get the Ukrainian settlement process onto a political and diplomatic track, despite all decisions to resume the supply of weapons, although no one in reality ever stopped those supplies. So that's Peskov. He's still pushing for the Ukrainians to turn up in Istanbul and to come up with their proposals, their counter proposals to the Russian memorandum. The Ukrainians are showing a complete lack of enthusiasm in doing that. Zelensky has spoken out against it. He clearly doesn't want it. My own guess is that he's going to be phoning up Trump, or trying to get Trump to agree for the entire Istanbul process to be dropped, and he will want Trump to go for the sanctions route instead, and tell Trump that in place of negotiations, the negotiations in Istanbul, what needs to happen instead is that the Russians need to be presented with that ultimatum they were going to be presented with back in May, requiring them to agree immediately to an unconditional ceasefire or to face sanctions. I've already discussed in many programs why I don't think Trump has any real enthusiasm for this course. He talks about looking at sanctions and strongly inclined to look at sanctions. But I think he understands now the economic consequences and the political consequences for the United States in taking that step. He would not just be up against the Russians, he would be up against the Chinese and probably the other BRIC states as well. And I think for all sorts of very good reasons, the effect on the price of oil, the possible effect of shortages of rare earths, the effect on supplies of important finished goods in the United States, the potential inflationary consequences on the United States of a further twist like that in the economic war. I think he basically wants to avoid going down that route. But anyway, that I think is the one that Zelensky now is going to advocate, and which the Europeans are going to back Zelensky in. Now, even as all of this is going on, the two terrible twins, Starmer and Macron, have been having their meeting in London, and over the next couple of days, the next big session of the Coalition of the Willing is also going to take place in London. Macron and Starmer, of course, are going to be there, and we'll see who else turns up, either virtually or in person, for this meeting, which it ought to be said clearly is leading absolutely nowhere. Now, this was a big visit in terms of the way in which the British and the French played it out. The British rolled out the red carpet. Macron addressed the British Parliament. He got enthusiastic applause when he spoke about Europe needing to continue to support Ukraine. He said that the Europeans need to reduce their dependence on both China and the United States. Of course, he's been saying something like this ever since he became president of France. But one can't see that all of those fine words that he has made have made the slightest difference. In fact, if you're talking about economic dependence on China, that has probably increased. And, of course, deindustrialization processes in Europe have undoubtedly increased, and France's financial position has become shakier. And if you're talking about military and security issues, arguably, Europe is even more dependent now on the United States. In fact, it certainly is more dependent on the United States than it was when Macron became president. And of course, as a result of the sanctions against Russia, it is now dependent on the United States for essential energy imports as well. So anyway, Macron said all of this. He also said other things that his British hosts presumably wouldn't have liked, like blaming the British themselves for the migrant crisis that they're suffering from, and all of those kind of things. But the long and the short of it is that despite all the ceremonies, all the pomp, all the talk about the new Entente Cordiale, all the talk about the British and the French needing to come together to face down the threat from the authoritarians, including apparently Donald Trump. Despite all of that talk, absolutely nothing new or original or interesting was proposed at all. Macron has recently spoken to Vladimir Putin. He doesn't seem to have come away with any new ideas after that call, or at least if he has any ideas. And Macron is somebody who's always coming up with ideas, but if he had any new ideas, he certainly didn't present them to this meeting, during this visit to the British. He has no plans for economic revival in Europe, for reindustrialization in Europe, for a new technological revival in Europe, for new security arrangements in Europe. He didn't talk about any kind of intelligent diplomatic outreach to the Russians. He made no proposals for a rethinking of the stance on Ukraine, and he repeated all the same old tropes that he always does, and he had no new thinking to announce about the situation in the Middle East either. He is supposed to be, at least by his own estimation, the most intelligent, the most creative of all of Europe's leaders. Well, if that is true, and it probably is, by the way, given what a completely empty bunch they all of them are, well, if that is true, then he is out of ideas, and so are they. It was a message of more of the same that has failed for the last 3.5 years, but just keep on doing it, even as it fails further and further. It's very difficult to be optimistic about Europe at this time. Perhaps the best that can be said is that the situation is so bad that we're at some point, we can't be so far now from the point when things hit bottom. And at that point, who knows, maybe they'll start getting better, though I wouldn't put any money on it. But anyway, the one thing that one can say with confidence, judging from what Macron and Starmer were saying over the course of Macron's visit, which of course still continues, and the coalition of the willing meeting, which is about to happen, is that it's going to be more of the same, and that they will certainly, almost certainly, support Zelensky if Zelensky tells Trump and tells the Americans that he doesn't want to send negotiators to Istanbul. And there is no point in doing so, given that the Russians are still making demanding terms which Zelensky himself judges are unacceptable. Well, there it is. Now, there's been some rather concerning stories circulating about Ukraine. The Turkish media, perhaps possibly reflecting annoyance on Erdogan's part, but then this might also be true, are claiming that that Ukraine came very close to a serious nuclear accident at one of its nuclear power stations. This would have been, by the way, completely independent of the special military operation. The Russians have been very careful never to attack any of Ukraine's nuclear power stations. Anyway, supposedly, and this is entirely down to the Turkish media, which I do not consider particularly reliable or at all reliable on these questions. Anyway, according to the Turkish media, one of Ukraine's nuclear power stations came close to a serious accident. The Ukrainians themselves have covered that up and apparently got help from the International Atomic Energy Agency in doing that. Well, if that is true, the Russians are going to find out about it, because they have by now, in fact, they unquestionably do have now, a very sophisticated intelligence gathering operation in Ukraine. And that is going to undermine the status of the IAEA even further directly after the debacle of the breakdown in Iran, the attack on Iran. Now, Lavrov has again actually made another verbal attack on the IAEA, and this time he came very close. In fact, he only just stopped short of demanding Grossi's resignation. So the Russians are starting to talk in that way. And the Iranian foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, by the way, again connected to the debacle of the attack on Iran. The attack on Iran in the middle of negotiations, has now written a long article in the Financial Times in which he said that the negotiations between the United States and Iran were indeed making very good progress, that the Israeli attack in the middle of the negotiations and the US's decision to join the attack has in effect wrecked the negotiations, that it was a betrayal of diplomacy, and that makes it impossible for Iran to trust the United States any further, and that Iran therefore does require these cast iron guarantees from the United States that there will be no such further attacks before negotiations resume. And as I've discussed in several programs, I am not sure how the United States, how Donald Trump can in fact provide those sorts of guarantees. Now, I've devoted some significant part of this program to talking about the missile crisis that the United States is now facing. There's been much talk about how this missile crisis is weakening the American position against China. It is also perhaps more immediately and urgently weakening the American position against Iran. The Guardian, in that article that I discussed recently, earlier in this program, spoke about the Iranians having a stockpile of at least 1,000 missiles. Netanyahu himself put the stockpile much higher. He said it was 22,000 missiles. Iranian spokesmen, like Professor Marandi, are saying that during the 12-day war, Iran only used its older missiles, presumably in order to deplete the Israeli air defense system, which it succeeded in doing, that the Iranians have not actually used against Israel or the United States so far their more advanced missiles that they have been holding back in reserve. In the absence of negotiations between the United States and Iran, and with the United States, as I've already said, having now lost track of the whereabouts of Iran's enriched uranium, and indeed of the entire status of Iran's nuclear program, the possibility of a resumption of the conflict, of the war between Iran, Israel, and the United States remains very high. How does the United States address that challenge from Iran if it does not have air defense interceptors, given that we're talking about a missile war in its purest form? I would have thought it was impossible. The missile war, the 12-day war with Iran, was a massive strategic mistake. A strategic mistake made by the president in allowing Prime Minister Netanyahu to try out his regime change operation in Iran, which failed completely. And a mistake on the part of Prime Minister Netanyahu in taking on an adversary which is in so many respects bigger than himself. Ukraine and the United States and the Europeans are now having to adjust to that decision. The crisis with Iran has now deepened America's overall strategic crisis. Now, here I'm going to finish by saying that the president of Iran, alongside the foreign minister of Iran, has now been speaking to the US media. In fact, President Pezeshkian gave a long interview to Tucker Carlson, and he's disclosed his belief that on the 12th and 13th of June, during the initial attacks, the Israelis were also coming after him. But I have to say that overall, I found Pezeshkian's contribution, his handling of the interview, very underpowered. And I understand that this is the general consensus in Iran also, that this was the moment for Pezeshkian to come out and set out the position, Iranian position, strongly, and to argue the case strongly for Iran, and that ultimately he failed to do that. He was so anxious that to appear reasonable, that in the end he pulled his punches. And I understand that Iranian social media has been saying this. A lot of people on Iranian social media have been saying this. And I have to say that this strengthens a perspective of Pezeshkian that I think a lot of people are gradually coming to. That he is the wrong man at this particular time. That perhaps means that as developments evolve, he's going to be increasingly sidelined. And if so, that is also going to have its implications going forward in this conflict between Israel and Iran, and between Iran and the United States. All of this, as I said, coming back to what I said, means that the United States faces a deepening overcommitment crisis. I have been writing about this for years, but we now see its practical effects. At various times, Trump himself and members of his administration, including Marco Rubio, have seemed to have shown some grasp of this, but they have never translated that understanding that into any practical action. And this overcommitment crisis is growing. My guess is that we are not far from that Suez moment that I spoke about earlier in this program. Anyway, that's me for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Star, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.